No.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for coming along and thanks for the invitation to talk about my favorite topic. Today, I'm going to be talking about rethinking measurement validity. So before I get into how I think we should rethink measurement validity, I want to give you a little bit of background on why I think we should be rethinking measurement validity. Now, I'm going to illustrate the ideas of my talk focusing around a measure of social cognitive ability, the reading the mind and the eyes test, and I'm going to talk a lot about the best practices in the psychological sciences, but the concept of validity that I'm going to introduce and the problems that I'm going to raise should have broader applicability. So if you're coming from other disciplines as well, I hope that you'll find this useful and relevant for your research areas as well. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with the reading the mind and the eyes test, it contains 36 multiple choice items like this one, where you match emotions to eye expressions, and if you get the answer right, in this case upset, you get a point. So add up your score, total points out of 36, and higher scores are supposed to indicate higher levels of social cognitive ability. Now, this is not just some obscure test. It's actually one of the most widely used measures of social cognitive ability. A recent review of adult measures of theory of mind, it was used in about 4.5 times more of the studies they identified than the next most widely used measure, so it's quite widely used. National Institute of Mental Health in the US currently recommends it as a current best option for assessing the ability to understand mental states. It's been referred to as one of the most well-validated measures. And you'll see across the literature, people referring to it as a well-validated measure. Okay, so that's the eyes test. Before I came across the eyes test, I hadn't really thought much about measurement validity. If I was reading a psychological research study, I just sort of assumed that the measures in there were going to be pretty good. Somebody would have vetted them somewhere along the line before this paper got published. But the eyes test changed that for me. So if you look at these two images here, they're two of the images from the eyes test items. I've taken away the response choices for a minute. So I can picture those two people are on opposite sides of a room. They catch each other's eyes and they smile at each other. But if we actually look at the choices that were given for those items in the eyes test, all of the response options are relatively negative. So for me, this raised red flags about the validity of this test. The pictures look positively valenced. The target correct responses are negatively valenced. And because this test is so widely used and purportedly well validated, this also raised red flags for me then about psychological measurement more broadly. So then I started looking into how do we validate our measures? So now pretty quickly saw that a lot of associations like the American Psychological Association, their recommendations are based on the construct validation approach. Now, that could be a talk in and of itself of what the construct validation approach is, but for now, basically the idea is there's not a single piece of evidence you can have to look at whether or not measures and measurements are valid, right? So you're going to combine lots of different types of evidence and build up and then look at how valid the measure is. So that's one element of this. But a second one is that tests are not necessarily going to perform the same across different samples and different groups. So the best practice is to actually estimate reliability and validity in every single sample to make sure that tests are working as they should be. Okay, so armed with this bit of information, I was curious. Let's go look at the eyes test. If it's a widely used and well-validated measure, then there should be a large body of research that's reporting different sorts of validity evidence for it. So my colleagues and I said, all right, let's go out, let's conduct a systematic scoping review, let's find as many studies as we can that have used the eyes test, and let's look at this evidence that should be existing for it out there. So we found 1,461 studies that had used the test, and we extracted 6 different types of validity evidence. So what you see here in green is the percentage of studies that actually reported these different types of validity evidence. The combined column on the end gives a study credit if it's reported even just one type of these evidence. And what we found is only 23% of studies actually reported within their own sample any of these 6 types of evidence. Now, I actually personally extracted evidence from every single one of these studies. So I can also say it's not like there's some other types of evidence that we didn't calculate here that were there. There just wasn't much evidence. And arguably more concerningly, the evidence that was there wasn't particularly supportive. If anything, it suggested that the test is problematic. And also concerning, so amongst these tests, there were tests where the eyes test was used during awake brain surgery to help surgeons avoid resecting brain regions that are important for social cognitive ability. It's a pretty high stakes use, right? And a recent review I came across when preparing this talk Of the 30 studies that they identified that used measures of social cognitive ability during awake brain surgery, 22 of these studies used the reading the mind in the eyes test. And the authors weren't fazed by this. They just described it, like many other studies, as a well-validated test. Outside of research, the eyes test was actually used in the recently discontinued parenting competency tests in Greenland. So that means, to some small extent, parents' answers on the eyes test might have impacted whether or not their children remained in their custody. So whether or not this test is measuring what it's supposed to has some high stakes impacts, right? And this is not just one anomalous measure. If you start looking then across the psychological sciences, you'll see people raising concerns. Look, we're not really providing a lot of evidence to show that our measures are actually measuring what they're supposed to, and this is a problem. Now, so from those of you coming from background in other areas, hopefully you're doing better, but maybe this resonates with you as well. So my first takeaway is that we're far too credulous toward measurement, at least psychological measurement. So what's going on here? So when we have problems with measurement practices and they're not going how we might ideally think they will, we can look to systematic problems. So obviously there's not reporting requirements saying you have to report evidence because all these studies are being published without it. And then incentives, if you don't have to report the evidence, well, it takes more effort to report it than not. And also, if your evidence shows your measures may be not valid, you're probably going to have a harder time getting your study published, right? So incentives and requirements are not there. But I don't think this on its own is a satisfactory response, or that just saying, all right, we need to report more is going to fix the problem. So there are some other researchers like Boersboom and colleagues in CISIC saying, well, look, actually, when you look at it, there's not a lot of clarity about how we should be assessing validity, what types of evidence we need. So I showed this nice, pretty picture of this puzzle coming together with all these different types of validity evidence fitting neatly together, but that's not really how it works, right? The different types of evidence might point in different directions. Some might show validity, some might show not. Which ones are more important? Are some of them essential? Do some of them rely on other ones? So there's not really a lot of clear guidelines, at least in psychology, about what we should be reporting, how we should be interpreting it, and how we all pull it together. So it is possible that some people are just tuning out because there aren't clear guidelines. So sort of taking up that approach, my colleagues and I decided we would rethink measurement validity a little bit, and we build on some existing ideas and introduce some novel ideas of our own. So there's a paper there, you can check them out. Today I'm going to point out a couple of the key things that I think are useful. All right, so one of the things looking at the eyes test literature that jumped out at me was that idea, this valid test. So all of these studies saying we used a valid test. Now, of course, with the eyes test, this is problematic because there's not any validity evidence to back it up. But I started thinking just more broadly about, is there a problem with this idea of a valid test more generally? And actually, the construct validation approach has something to say about this. If you look at the recommendations, they say, actually, you shouldn't really be talking about the validity of tests as such. We should be talking about the validity of the interpretations of test scores that those tests are producing and the uses of those test scores. So it's wrong, according to construct validation, to even talk about the validity of a test. Okay, so we should stop talking about that, right? And why might valid tests be problematic? Well, so Boersboom comes in and says, well, actually, realistically, and I think probably if I asked all of you, when we think about validity, we do think about tests. And in particular, we think about whether the test is measuring what it's supposed to measure. I think that's how I thought about it before reading construct validation. And there is some sort of intuitive appeal to that. But so why is that problematic? Well, one problem is that no test is always going to measure what it's supposed to measure, right? We're going to have user error. We're going to have contextual factors. I'm pretty happy that most thermometers are pretty reliable, valid ways to measure temperature, but take your mercury thermometer somewhere too cold, the mercury column freezes, it's not going to work, right? Even some measures that we're quite confident in, there are contextual factors that can impact how they function. So this makes it important for us to be asking, have we actually measured what we're trying to measure? And even with the case of thermometers, so when my kids were young and I was taking their temperature, I usually felt their forehead first, right? And if they were a bit hot, I'd get the thermometer. And sometimes I'd put it in and I was pretty sure they had a fever, but it came out as normal. And then I'd realize I hadn't placed it right and I'd use it again. And yeah, that was user error, right? But in that case, I have something to contrast with. So the measure's coming out and I'm going, wait, that's not quite right. So I check again. Psychological measurement, we don't often have these sort of sense checkers, right? If I use the reading the mind and the eyes test and I get my score, there might not be some obvious thing to go, oh, wait, it's not working properly or as expected. So this kind of have we measured what we're trying to measure question is arguably even more important with psychological measures. But yeah, in the eyes test literature, it looked like maybe this idea of a valid test was overshadowing this question because everyone's saying, oh, but I used a valid test. By definition, a valid test measures what it's supposed to. So yeah, that valid test measured what I was trying to measure. Okay, so maybe construct validation approaches onto something. Measures are not valid. We shouldn't think of it that way. That's not satisfying to me either. I think Boersboom and colleagues are onto something, right? So yeah, measures are not valid, and yet some measures are more not valid than others, right? Thermometer might not always work how I'm anticipating, but still can be pretty confident. Now, some of you may have seen this particular cartoon before. For a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Of course, different animals are going to find that challenging for different reasons. Now, I've added my own little caption to this here saying, all right, this is measuring oppositional defiant disorder in pets. Okay, so we can see this measure is more not valid than the thermometer, right? So there is something to this idea that a test can kind of have a certain level of validity. So I don't think that answer of let's just not talk about validity in relation to tests is very satisfying. So instead, what we propose in our paper is that we shouldn't be arguing about is validity about tests or is validity about measurements or about interpretations of measurements. We should be looking at both of these things. Tests can have something that we call validity potential in the paper, and measurements can have something else that we call realized validity. So realized validity targets this very important question of have we measured what we were trying to measure? And like best practice recommendations, we should be looking at this in every study and in our sample, finding evidence. Did we actually measure what we wanted to? Yes, okay, we have realized validity. We have valid test scores. We can interpret them as a measure of whatever. By contrast, validity potential asks a different, but also very important question. How likely is it that this test will measure what we want it to measure? And this one we need to ask before we collect any data, because we don't want to be wasting resources conducting studies with measures that were never going to produce valid measurements in the first place. Okay, so basically the idea is the greater a measurement's validity potential, the more confident that we can be it will produce valid measurements. So in general, thermometers were pretty confident, but validity potential never guarantees valid measurements. So we always also need to think about this realized validity, what actually happened. So my second takeaway is that valid measure doesn't equal valid measurements, okay? So don't think about, I used a valid measure, therefore I have valid measurements. Not good enough. Now in our paper, we sort of also say, look, don't talk about valid measures. I don't think that's actually the most useful way to think about it. I think it's okay to talk about valid measures as long as a valid measure is one that has the potential to produce valid measurements. Some measures just don't have any validity. They're never going to produce valid measurements, all right? Once we're thinking about it in that contingent sort of way, I think that that's okay. All right, so how do we actually assess validity then? So I've basically just doubled the problem, right? Now we have validity potential and realized validity to assess, but haven't actually figured out how we're going to determine either of these things. Luckily, they are related and they both actually rely on the same question, which is what is a valid measurement, right? Validity potential is a test's potential to produce valid measurements. Realized validity is whether or not valid measurements have been produced. Both of these things depend on our understanding of what actually a valid measurement is. Now, if we come back to the construct validation for this, it can be a little problematic in that you realize that construct validation is actually not measurement specific. So it defines validity as the degree to which evidence and theory support interpretations of scores for proposed test uses. But critically, we can interpret test scores in a variety of ways, of which measurement is just one. So we could also interpret them as predictions of some outcome or as diagnostic for some condition, right? So this isn't inherently problematic, but it can lead to issues again with that idea of clarity. So what is valid measurement as opposed to these other interpretations, and what evidence do we need to establish valid measurement? And one problem is this kind of makes validity a moving target, right? Because the requirements for measurement can and do differ from the requirements for good prediction. And in the paper, we talk about the example of internal consistency, how in some cases for measurement can actually be really necessary for valid measurement, whereas actually in prediction, sometimes lower internal consistency can go along with better prediction, right? So this is problematic if we don't clearly define what are these different types, what is valid prediction, what is valid measurement, how do we establish it? Okay, so once we focused in on measurement and think about what are the requirements for valid measurement, so we jump on board with Borsboom and colleagues and Aaron and say, well, I think valid measurement requires a causal relationship from what we're trying to measure to the measurement outcome. Now, I don't know if I'm showing on your screens, but imagine my left hand here is the attribute we're trying to measure. My right hand over here is the measurement outcomes. If these things are just kind of moving around independently of each other, then my measurement outcomes aren't very informative about the current state of the attribute I'm interested in, right? Whereas if they're causally related and they're moving together. Now, interestingly, if we come back to construct validation approach and the standards for education and psychological testing, and we look at the content in there that is specific to measurement as opposed to prediction and other things, it's also consistent with this idea of this causal relationship. They give the example, if I have a test that I want to assess mathematics reasoning, then it becomes important to determine whether test takers are in fact reasoning instead of using some other strategies, right? Good performance needs to be caused by good mathematics reasoning. So causal condition, I think, is pretty straightforward. I'd be open to other people arguing against it, but for me, it just makes sense that valid measurement is going to have a causal relationship. Okay, so my takeaway 3 is that in order to assess measurement validity, we need to think about causes and confounds. So in the paper, the 3 things we say in this concept of validity, first, let's make this distinction between validity potential and realized validity. Let's focus on measurement so we can be really clear about the requirements of measurement, and the requirement of measurement is going to be this causal relationship. Now, we talk a little bit about in the paper about, look, here are some approaches people do to causal modeling and thinking about causality. But you could now say, all right, great, you've given all this, but I don't actually feel any more well-placed to go away now and start assessing measurement validity than I did before you came up with this alternative way of thinking about validity, right? And actually, causal modeling is really hard. And so maybe assessing validity is going to be really hard. But what I want to add, so section 4 of this talk that I've crammed the first bits in together because I want to actually step back, and I've been thinking about a particular question that I think is helpful for framing this causal concept of measurement without getting into the details of actually trying to causally model relationships and stuff like that. And I think even just asking this question can help us move our measurement assessment forward in hopefully maybe a little more tractable way. So before we get to that, because I've just motor mouthed through a 30-minute talk in hopefully about 20 minutes, a little bit of audience participation time. So this is an item that I created years ago, kind of modeled off the AIMOS test, and your task is to choose the word that best describes the animal in the picture. You can enter your answers in the chat if you want, or you can just think about it in your head. But yeah, your choices here are wolf, lion, bear, and elephant. All right, hopefully everyone's had enough time to look at that because I'm going to move on. We are going to come back to this though. Okay, so the question that I think can be helpful, at least in the case of performance-based tests like the AIMOS test, where there's correct and incorrect responses, I think there are similarly themed questions we can ask for self-report measures, but we're not going to talk about that today. So what makes the hard items hard? So the AIMOS test is often used as a test of emotion recognition ability. And a problem that a lot of emotion recognition ability tests have is that they have ceiling effects. So you can kind of distinguish between people who just can't recognize emotions from facial expressions at all and those who can, but trying to differentiate between those who can do it really well, those who can do it pretty well, those who can do it average, that actually gets really hard. But the AIMOS test manages to avoid these ceiling effects, and very few people get all the items correct, right? But in order for that to actually be making meaningful distinctions based on emotion recognition, those hard items need to be hard because people with better emotion recognition can answer them. They require more emotion recognition. And so we need to kind of assess that, right? One thing to think about when we think about what makes the hard items hard is that there's actually no ground truth to the AIMOS test. So the test creators went out, got pictures from magazines, picked the correct response, picked the other choices, made up the items, tested them with some pilot samples, make sure that the majority of people are picking the right answer, and we don't have too many people picking the same wrong answer, right? But if you look at these two items, one from the adult version of the test and one from the child version, both created by the same research group, we can see the lack of ground truth in the fact that the adult answer is somewhat negatively valenced uneasy, while the child's eye test answer is a neutral or positively valenced interested, right? No ground truth. So let's come back here for a second to our animal identification test. Now, I haven't looked to see what you all have put in the chat, but if you're not too deviant from previous groups that I've looked at, the majority, although maybe not all of you, are going to have gone with lion. But there's no ground truth here either, right? Because it's a dog. So some of you are going to have picked lion because you're going to see what's the prototypical thing of a lion is this mane, right? So this is informative. You know something about lions, and that's why you're picking lion. But the question we need to be thinking about maybe is not so much what's getting people to pick lion. And this is a relatively easy item. Most people get it right. What we need to think about is people who are getting it wrong. Why is it hard for them? Why are they getting it wrong? So imagine that person who has their chow chow at home and they look at these eyes and they're like, oh, that's my dog Charlie, right? And they're picturing the whole snout and everything. And that looks more like a bear. Because I think if you look at this whole picture here, you might agree that's more like a bear than a lion, right? Or what about that person who's like, well, it's a dog. And I know it's a dog. None of these things are dogs. So wolf is closest semantically. I'm going to go with wolf. Or alternatively, that person who's like, this is stupid. None of those items match. I'm going to go with elephant because that's the least like this thing when none of the answers are good, right? So interpreting those wrong answers as evidence of poor motion recognition, animal recognition ability is obviously going to be flawed, right? So let's come back to the eyes test. Now, I've already pointed out one thing that might make this test hard, right? This mismatch, positively valenced images, negatively valenced response choice, right? But interestingly, the distrustful item is actually relatively easy. Most people get that one right, not everyone. The cautious one is one of the hardest items. So I'm going to come back to why that might be when similar kind of problems here. But another thing, maybe the use of obscure terms, right? Somebody's like, all right, it's positive. I know distrustful, baffled, and terrified are negative. Aghast, I haven't heard of that one, so I'm going to pick that. And we can also apply that strategy over here too, right? Or maybe it's just the insufficient context, right? So like in the dog one, there's just these bit of eyes. Some people might bring the full context of the dog image with them. We don't know what other context people are bringing, right? Is this person feeling doubtful, affectionate, playful, aghast? Oh, look, there's aghast again. Right. Or what about inconsistent expectations? So here on the right, the answer is fantasizing, right? Maybe I can kind of see that looking off to the side a little bit, right? So I'm going to take that strategy over to this tricky question over here. This one's a little trickier because both affectionate and playful seem like, you know, they could go with that. The eyes are similar to the other one, right? I'm just going to take a chance that I'm going to go with affectionate. Bow. Too bad. This time the answer is doubtful. Now, interestingly, on this item, at least 2 studies I know of actually changed the correct answer to affectionate because that was the most popular answer. This also could explain why the internal consistency on the eyes test is so poor. Performance on one item tends to correlate very poorly with other ones because use the exact same strategy on these 2 items and you're going to get one wrong and one right. And actually getting the fantasizing one right predicts that you're actually going to get the doubtful one wrong. People who pick fantasizing there are more likely to pick affectionate, right? So there you go. So problematic test. So again, if we return to this cautious item and why this is harder than the distrustful one explanation is that there is a more plausible alternative. So in the distrustful, aghast, baffled, and terrified, most people just find those 2 wrong to pick. So let's go with distrustful. Whereas cautious versus, my thing is covering, I can't actually remember what the other choice is. What is it, interested or something? Anyway, those are 2 more plausible, so it makes it harder, right? And people do pick that item. All right, so my 4th takeaway from this is that we need to start thinking about how our measures work. Sometimes people respond to my criticisms of the eyes test and go, well, you know what, actually it worked in my research. And what do they mean by that? It found group differences between whatever groups they're looking at. So it worked. But in order for it to have worked, it matters why it found group differences. Why did those 2 groups perform differently on that measure? Now, hopefully that was around 30 minutes and I haven't talked too fast that you couldn't follow. So thank you.